The drive back to Millhaven takes 4 hours from DC if you skip the rest stops, and I skipped all of them. I kept both hands on the wheel and let the GPS do the talking because I didn't trust myself to make decisions. Left on Route 29, right on Old Mill Road. Continue for 11 miles. The instructions were simple. Everything else about this weekend was not. I hadn't been back in 3 years. Not for Christmas, not for my grandmother's birthday, not for any of the reasons my father left on my voicemail in that careful, neutral tone he used when he wanted something but didn't want to ask for it directly. I'd listened to every message. I just hadn't come. This time was different. This time, the invitation hadn't come from my father. It had come from the Millhaven Veterans of Foreign Wars Post 114, addressed formally to Dr. Claire Whitmore, and it had asked me to attend the annual ceremony honoring the county's service members past and present. My grandfather had been a post member for 40 years before he died. My father had been a member for 20. And somewhere in the records they kept in that small brick building on Elm Street, there was a plaque with my name on it from when I'd completed my service commitment and left, quietly, without ceremony, without explanation, 3 years ago. I hadn't asked them to put my name on anything. That was just the kind of town Millhaven was. The thing about small towns is that they remember everything, and they remember it wrong. By the time I pulled off the highway and onto the county road, I already knew what the story would be. I'd heard the version my stepmother Diane had been circulating since I left. I knew because my cousin Marcus had texted me about it, apologetically, the way he always delivered bad news, buried under 3 lines of small talk and a joke that didn't land. "She's been telling people you washed out," he'd written. "That the army let you go. That you came back because you had nowhere else to go." I hadn't corrected it. That was my mistake, maybe. Or maybe it was a choice. I've never been entirely sure which. The farmland opened up on both sides of the road, flat and gold in the late October light, and I thought about my grandfather, who used to drive this same stretch every Sunday morning to get to the diner on Main Street, and who never once talked about the 2 years he spent in Korea, except to say that the cold there was different from any cold he'd ever known before or since. A specific cold, he said. The kind that got into the vocabulary of your bones and never quite left. I understood that better now than I had when he told me. I turned into my father's driveway at 4:15. The house looked the same. White clapboard, green shutters, the oak tree in the front yard that my father had been threatening to cut down since I was 8 years old and that was still standing, still dropping acorns on the roof every fall. Some things hold their ground without making a production of it. My father was on the porch before I had my bag out of the trunk. He looked older. Not dramatically. Just the way people accumulate time in their faces when you're not watching it happen gradually. The gray at his temples had spread. He moved a little more carefully down the porch steps. "You made it," he said. "I said I would." He nodded. There was a moment where neither of us moved, and then he reached out and took my bag from my hand, which was his way of saying he was glad I was there, which was as close as we'd ever gotten to certain things. "Diane's inside," he said. "She's getting ready." I followed him up the porch steps and through the front door. Diane was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and her phone, wearing a silk blouse I recognized from holidays past. She looked up when I came in and gave me the smile she'd been giving me since I was 14 years old, the one that started at her mouth and stopped there, like it couldn't quite clear whatever checkpoint existed somewhere behind her eyes. "Claire." She set down her phone. "We weren't sure you'd actually come. Here I am. You look tired. Is it the drive? Long week." She made a sound that managed to be sympathetic and dismissive at the same time, a talent she'd developed over years of practice. "Well, it's a big night for your father, so I'm sure you'll find the energy." She picked her phone back up. Conversation over. I went upstairs to the guest room, sat on the edge of the bed, and looked at the ceiling for approximately 4 minutes. Then I unpacked my dress, hung it on the back of the door, and went to wash my face. My father knocked at 5:45. "About ready? Give me 5 minutes." I heard him pause in the hallway. "Diane mentioned she ran into Carol Hutchins at the grocery store. Told her you'd be here tonight." He paused again. "Carol has a lot of friends at the post. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. Okay. I just mean, people will be glad to see you. It's been a while. I know, Dad. Another pause. Then, we're proud of you. For coming. We're glad you came, is all. I listened to his footsteps retreat down the hall. I finished getting ready. The VFW hall was 10 minutes from the house, a low brick building with a parking lot that was already 3/4 full when we arrived. American flags on either side of the entrance. A handwritten sign in the window. Annual honor ceremony. All veterans welcome. My father went ahead to find a seat at the post members table. I followed Diane through the entrance, where folding tables held name tags and programs and a donation jar for the scholarship fund. A woman I didn't recognize, young, maybe 20, in a volunteer lanyard, handed me a program and smiled. I found a seat near the back. Diane settled in 2 seats down and immediately began scanning the room, cataloging who was there, which was her primary activity at any social event I'd ever attended with her. The hall filled in over the next 20 minutes. I recognized faces the way you recognize faces in a town where you grew up. Not always with names attached, but with context. The man who ran the hardware store. My 8th grade history teacher, gray now, sitting with a woman I assumed was his wife. Various people I'd been in 4-H with, in high school with, had sat next to in church basements and bleachers and waiting rooms over the course of a childhood. Carol Hutchins appeared, with her husband Ray, and made her way to a table near the center of the room. She caught my eye and waved with genuine warmth. Carol had always been kind, the sort of person who meant every smile she gave. I waved back. Diane leaned slightly in my direction without turning her head. "You know she asked me about you last week," she said at the volume people use when they want to be overheard. "At the Kroger. Wanted to know how you were doing now that things didn't work out." I looked at the program in my hands. "Things worked out fine." "Well." She smoothed her blouse. "I told her you were doing okay. Considering." "Huh. Considering what?" "I just mean it can't be easy, starting over. After the Army lets you go." I kept my eyes on the program. "I wasn't in the Army, Diane." "I know that, Claire. I'm just saying how it looks to people." I didn't answer. The lights dimmed slightly toward the front of the room, and the post commander moved to the microphone to start the program. I was grateful for the interruption. The ceremony took about 45 minutes. There were readings from the post chaplain, a recognition of deceased members from the past year, a short address from a state legislator who seemed genuinely moved and not merely obligated. My father was called up with 4 other post members who had hit significant service milestones, and he stood at the front of the room looking slightly embarrassed and very proud, the way he always looked when people made a fuss about him, and I watched him and felt the complicated, irreducible thing I always felt about my father, which contained equal parts love and grief and 20 years of not quite knowing how to bridge a particular kind of distance. When the formal program ended, the tables rearranged themselves into conversation clusters. Someone started a coffee urn in the corner. A man with a guitar began playing something quiet near the back wall. I got up to get coffee. When I turned around with my cup, Diane was standing with Carol Hutchins and 2 women I didn't know, and she was telling them something with the particular animation she reserved for stories she'd refined through multiple tellings. "Really just wasn't suited for it," she was saying. "Some people aren't, and there's no shame in that." She was always more of an academic type. The structure didn't fit. But she's doing fine now. She has a little consulting job up in DC. She caught me over Carol's shoulder and smiled. "There she is. Claire, come say hello." I walked over. Carol hugged me, which I was grateful for. "It's so good to see you," Carol said, and meant it. "How are you doing, really?" "Really well, actually." Diane was just saying I heard. I smiled at Carol specifically because the smile was for her and not for the story that had just been told about me. "I'm doing well. It's good to be back." Diane touched my arm briefly, the way she did when she wanted to signal that a conversation was moving in a direction she controlled. "We were just saying it must be a nice change of pace from Dr. Whitmore." The voice came from behind me, and it carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard without raising their register. I turned. The woman was in her mid-50s, silver-haired, in a dark suit with a small lapel pin I recognized immediately. Next to her stood a man in his 40s in a sport coat, and behind them, two other people whose bearing I placed before I registered their faces. I knew her. I had briefed her, twice, in rooms that required clearances I no longer held in my current position. "General Hartwell," I said. "Brigadier General Susan Hartwell, currently assigned to the Pentagon's Legislative Affairs Office, and before that, 18 months as deputy commander of a medical research program I had helped build from a database query, and a set of policy recommendations, and 4 years of work that had happened mostly in the dark." She extended her hand. I shook it. "I saw your name on the program," she said. "I wasn't sure it was you. I'm here for my uncle. He's a post member." She glanced around the room with the alert, measuring look I remembered. "Are you from Millhaven? I grew up here." Small world. She turned to the people behind her and made a quick introduction. Her uncle, his wife, a colleague who'd come with her. Then she looked back at me. "I was going to reach out next month, actually. There's a working group being stood up. You'll probably be getting a formal communication, but I'd rather talk to people before the bureaucracy does. I think you know what the project is." "I can guess." "Good." She held my gaze for a moment. "The work you did on the protocol development, I mean this, it's still the framework we're using. 3 years later, we modified the implementation, but the core architecture is yours." She said it simply, factually, the way people state things that are just true. "I wanted you to know that if you didn't. I was aware in the peripheral way you become aware of things when your attention is focused elsewhere, that the circle around us had gone quiet, that Carol Hutchins had stopped mid-sentence, that one of the women Diane had been talking to had leaned slightly toward her companion, that my father, somewhere to my left, had turned from the conversation he'd been in, and I was aware of Diane, who had gone still in a way I had never seen her go still before. Not the stillness of listening, but the stillness of recalibrating. The way people look when a story they've been telling suddenly stops matching the room. "That means a lot," I said to General Hartwell. "Genuinely. I mean it genuinely." She smiled, which changed her face considerably. "The Undersecretary mentioned your name at a briefing in September. I thought you should know that too." She said a few more things. We talked for maybe 6 minutes, about the working group, about a mutual colleague who'd moved to the private sector, about nothing in particular. It was a normal conversation. It just happened to take place in the middle of a VFW hall in Millhaven, Virginia, in front of people who had been told a different story about who I was. When she excused herself to find her uncle's table, I turned back to the group. Carol was looking at me with an expression I didn't entirely know how to read, part surprise, part something warmer, part the specific look of someone who is privately rearranging information. The two women I didn't know had developed reasons to be somewhere else. Diane was holding her coffee cup with both hands, and she was looking at a point slightly to the left of my face, which was as close as she had ever come, in my presence, to not having something to say. My father was standing 3 feet away. I hadn't heard him approach. I looked at him. He looked at me. He had an expression I didn't have a name for. Not the careful neutral of the voicemails, not the mild pleasant of holiday dinners. Something that had more cost to it than either of those. "Protocol development," he said. "Not a question exactly. Medical research policy, for the Department of Defense." He nodded slowly. "That's what you've been doing." "That's part of what I've been doing." He looked at the table where General Hartwell had settled in with her uncle. He looked back at me. He was quiet for a long moment. And in that moment I saw, the way you see things that have been there all along once you stop trying not to look at them, that my father had known at some level that the story he'd been given didn't add up, that he'd let it stand anyway, that he was standing here now with the weight of that. "I didn't know," he said. "I didn't tell you. I should have asked." He said it quietly, not with drama, not with the performance of remorse, but with the specific plainness of a man saying a true thing he wished he'd understood sooner. It was, in 20 years, one of the most direct things he had ever said to me. "It's okay, Dad. It's not entirely." He looked at his shoes for a moment. But I'm glad you came home. I didn't say anything. Sometimes there isn't a response that improves on a silence, and I had learned, in the years since I'd left this town, to trust the silences that were full rather than empty. Later, after the guitar player packed up and the coffee urn went cold, and the parking lot began to clear, I stood outside the VFW hall in the October air and watched the last of the cars pull out. The night was cold and clear. The kind of clear you only get in small towns, away from the light pollution of the places I'd spent the last several years. The kind where you can see more stars than you feel like you've earned. My cousin Marcus found me out there. He was holding 2 bottles of water from the folding table inside, and he handed me one without being asked, which was the thing I'd always liked best about Marcus. "So," he said. "So. General Hartwell." He said it with the particular appreciation of someone who had watched the whole thing unfold from a good angle. "You didn't mention you knew a general. You didn't ask." He laughed. Diane looked like she swallowed something. "Marcus. I'm just saying." I opened the water bottle. Somewhere in the parking lot I could hear my father's voice, and then Diane's, lower and more clipped, the abbreviated conversation of people who had something to discuss but were saving it for the car. I didn't try to make out the words. That wasn't mine to manage. "Are you going to come back more?" Marcus asked. Now that. I'm not sure what changes. Seems like something changed. I considered that. The oak tree in my father's yard, still standing. My grandfather's name on a plaque inside, next to mine. The specific cold in the bones that some experiences leave behind, the kind that stays in the vocabulary of who you are even when the temperature changes. "I'll come back," I said. "But it won't be because of tonight." "What'll it be because of?" I looked up at the sky over Millhaven for a minute, at all that visibility I hadn't asked for and hadn't earned. But that was there anyway, which is how most of the true things in life arrive. "Because it's where I'm from," I said. "That doesn't go anywhere just because it's complicated." Marcus didn't say anything. He was good that way. Knew when something had finished and didn't try to add to it. We stood there in the cold for another few minutes, and then we went inside to find our families, which is also what you do when you're from somewhere, regardless of the complications. You go back in. You don't explain yourself, you just go back in.